Welcome to the CoastWA Training module on coastal hazard assessments. My name is Trent Hunt. I'm a Principal Coastal Engineer with MP Rogers and Associates, and will be stepping you through this training module today. This is one of a series of training modules that the CoastWA team, including DPLH, Department of Transport and WALGA, are putting together. And so far they've covered modules including coastal processes and coastal protection works, benefit distribution analysis, and the two most recent included coastal hazard assessments and vulnerability analysis and risk evaluation modules. As an overview of today's session, we'll discuss what a coastal hazard assessment is and do a brief recap on coastal processes and coastal hazards. We'll discuss when they're needed and how they're used, what are the outputs or standard outputs from coastal hazard assessments and what do they mean, how do you develop a coastal hazard assessment. We'll discuss some of the considerations and challenges you may encounter in preparing coastal hazard assessments, and then step through a number of examples and case studies. There's a number of reference documents and other guidelines around which are really relevant for coastal hazard assessments and the development of those. So the West Australian Coastal Zone Strategy provides an overview document for works in the coastal zone. SPP 2.6 and the State Coastal Planning Policy, in particular Schedule 1, delineates a methodology for calculating coastal erosion and inundation allowances, and the State Coastal Planning Policy guidelines provide guidance on those. The Coastal Hazard Risk Management Adaptation Planning Guidelines provide guidance on developing char maps in Western Australia. The Local Coastal Hazard Assessment template on the Department of Transport website provides guidance on coastal hazard assessments on a local scale and in short timeframes. And the Sea Level Change in Western Australia document provides guidance on appropriate allowances for sea level rise and their application to coastal planning in Western Australia. So we'll now provide a little recap on coastal hazards and coastal processes and the importance of these. So coastal hazards have been discussed in previous modules, but they're defined under State Coastal Planning Policy as the consequence of coastal processes that affect the environment and safety of people. So the impacts of the action of the ocean. And in this context, they're a source of potential harm. They include coastal erosion and coastal inundation, both of which are different and are assessed separately under our coastal hazard assessment and char map process. In a basic sense, the way I think about them in a coastal hazard context is coastal erosion is that horizontal change of a shoreline retreating or beach retreating and being lost. And coastal inundation or flooding is that vertical change of water levels increasing and flooding low-lying land. So coastal erosion can lead to undermining or loss of asset. It can act on varying timescales. So that classic storm erosion case you see where you experience a significant storm event and the beach disappears overnight. So it can be that acute kind of single event or series of events, or it can be a slow ongoing retreat where year on year you're losing sections and more of your beach and dunes. Now this can present significant risk to assets. The couple of photos we've shown on the right hand side there, you can see the top one is an example at Grace Darling Park in Lansdowne, a case where the public foreshore was retreating over a number of years and there was significant loss to the point where public assets were threatened, and then the sea rescue, volunteer rescue building was also being threatened. So significant you can get some public outcry and alarm when you see this risk of erosion to significant assets. The case at the bottom there is Bunbury Back Beach. Again, there's this trend of ongoing retreat, but exacerbated by some storm erosion events, which you can see are starting to threaten roads and significant assets. The second coastal hazard we'll discuss is coastal inundation. So that typical flooding of water level, often in response to storm events or sea level rise. And they're important differences. So coastal inundation can be either permanent or temporary. So you can, as sea levels continue to rise, we can see a permanent loss of land due to that rise. Or we can get that classic kind of temporary flooding of an area due to a single storm event, high rainfall event, high tide event, etc. Under the State Coastal Planning Policy, the coastal hazard assessments for coastal inundation also need to consider wave overtopping and the impacts they may have. Okay, so what is a coastal hazard assessment? Well, a coastal hazard assessment identifies potential coastal hazards which may impact assets. Now, often those assets are man-made, that's when we often see the greatest outcry, but those assets also include natural assets such as beaches, dunes, and vegetated areas. The coastal hazard assessment establishes an understanding of the potential impacts on those assets, including from coastal physical processes and sea level rise. It essentially determines the what, where, when, why, and how of the coastal hazards and their impacts. A coastal hazard assessment, as we discussed, is completed separately for coastal erosion and inundation, and both of these consider different events. So a coastal erosion event considers a 1% annual exceedance probability event, or in simple terms, often termed a 100-year ARI, average recurrence interval event. So that type of event that you'd expect to see once every 100 years. In reality, a 1% AEP event has a 63% occurrence of occurring over that 100-year time frame. The coastal inundation assessment, on the other hand, considers a 0.2% AEP or a 500-year ARI event, so an event we'd expect to see once every 500 years. In reality, there's an 18% occurrence of experiencing that event in a 100-year time frame. So the two are slightly different. A coastal hazard assessment is completed for a range of timeframes out to the 100 years, but often for short-term, medium, and longer-term timeframes. So when is a coastal hazard assessment needed, and how are they used? Well, a coastal hazard assessment is required by SPP 2.6, and it's part of the CHARMAP process. So it falls under Stage 2 risk identification process, and there's a range of scenarios where you might need to complete a coastal hazard assessment. It might be to understand risk to existing assets, to plan for a managed retreat pathway for existing assets which may be under threat, for new development in assessing the risk to that development or assets, or in determining foreshore reserve widths for those new developments, or subdivision approvals or proposals. So for existing assets or development built areas, and we can see the example here of the Rockingham foreshore where you've got highly valued and used public nodes close to the coast, you may want to identify hazards to assist in risk evaluation to those assets. So the coastal hazard assessment will be used in a CHARMAP process in identifying and understanding the risks to your foreshore and coastal assets. For a greenfields or undeveloped coastal site, on the other hand, a coastal hazard assessment would be used as an input to calculation of a foreshore reserve width. It may be calculated to understand risks to proposed development and how close to the coast those assets can be placed, as well as risks to lower scale assets within the foreshore reserve. So in determining the width of the foreshore reserve, and there's a little figure on the bottom of the screen which you may be able to read, the physical coastal processes and the coastal hazards are one input to that reserve width. Other things also need to be considered, such as biodiversity, environmental and recreational values, and public access. There are also other facilities which are reliant on their location on the coast. So community facilities such as surf clubs, volunteer sea rescue buildings, and others require to be placed close to the coast to perform their function. However, you still need to understand the coastal hazards and the risks to these assets. And there may be implications for management and use. So in this type of context, a coastal hazard assessment might be undertaken to determine, for instance, finished floor levels, locations and risks, and so on, to vehicle access ramps and the like. You can also complete a coastal hazard assessment for infill development or subdivisions and new DAs. So in cases where you may already have existing development, you might be completing a new subdivision proposal on an existing site or something similar. You still need to understand those hazards and how they lie, whether you need notifications on titles and the like, and the implication for management of that site. Okay, so they're the general cases we would complete a coastal hazard assessment for. We're now going to step through some of the outputs of coastal hazard assessment and how they might be used. Typically, your coastal hazard assessment outputs would include a report on the hazard assessment and the methodology undertaken, and how those coastal hazard zones were developed, and it will also include coastal erosion hazard and coastal inundation hazard maps. Occasionally, coastal hazard assessments might only consider coastal erosion or inundation, but typically we'd cover both. What do the maps mean? Well, coastal hazard maps, again, will be separate for erosion and inundation. They may be presented in a range of ways. They might show lines outlining extents of potential erosion or inundation. They might show shaded areas, which may show areas at risk of erosion or inundation. Those shaded areas may be gradated or different colours, typically presenting increasing or decreasing risk. You may have maps showing varying timeframes with different lines or shaded areas for different intervals, but typically out to 100 years. And in some cases, they may show things such as probabilities or likelihoods of being impacted by those coastal hazards. Ultimately, what the maps are attempting to show are areas or zones which are impacted by those coastal hazards. It's important to note, and we'll discuss this a little further later, the maps do not attempt to predict future coastline positions, but they're indicating areas which may be impacted over the planning period. And these are examples of your standard types of coastal erosion hazard maps. Some of these have been developed by us and some by other consultants, but they all show similar things. So on the right-hand side, we've got a series of lines on a map in the city of Wanneroo, again showing coastal erosion lines. The centre one is a section through the city of Stirling, showing areas of rocky coast and varying timescales of erosion. And the left-hand side one up in Geraldton again shows a series of lines showing the coastal hazard extents over varying timeframes. So these are pretty standard types of maps. The coastal erosion maps show the total coastal erosion allowances for a specific area and timeframes. So each of those lines presents the summed allowance of each of the individual factors, which we'll discuss shortly, but they include the S1 allowance for the risk of storm erosion, the S2 allowance for historic erosion trends, the S3 allowance for the future potential erosion caused by sea level rise, and then an additional allowance for uncertainty. They're all summed up and you get a total distance, which is measured from the horizontal shoreline datum, or HSD, and that's the reference line in all of these maps. And that distance back is then where those lines are presented. So the example which is shown on the right-hand side here, the HSD is the most seaward line, and each of the individual hazard allowances are then measured back from that. So the HSD, or horizontal shoreline datum, is the reference line for the mapping. It defines the active limit of the shoreline under storm activity. So it's similar to the historically used coastal vegetation lines, which were an indicator of the extent of the impact of the ocean, and it's taken as a contour representing the peak steady water level under storm activity. So it's the highest point that the water level can get to during that designed storm event. It's the reference line for all of the coastal hazard maps, and it dictates the starting point for distances on the coastal erosion hazard lines. Similarly, the coastal inundation hazard maps present shaded areas showing potential areas of inundation. So the two map examples which are shown here are slightly different. The one on the left-hand side, which is an area of Lancelin, shows different depths of inundation for a specific time frame in the shading. The right-hand side shows different time frames of areas which may be impacted by coastal inundation, but both are showing those potential areas impacted by the coastal flooding. So the coastal inundation maps show inundation hazard contours or areas. They show areas inundated or flooded by the 500-year ARI event or the 0.2% AEP event. They typically show present day and future cases, which include sea level rise, and they also include things such as dune breaching. So where you may only have a small, narrow primary dune in cross-sectional area, and there's a risk that that dune is breached in a significant storm event, well, that coastal inundation can potentially extend further inland, and that's shown through these maps. So the example which is shown on the left-hand side there is a section of Brighton Beach, and you can see that the difference in the 100-year inundation line extending much further back through those dunes in the area where we've got potential breaching. So that presents the main outputs of a coastal hazard assessment. We're now going to step through a basic methodology in developing a coastal hazard assessment. Schedule 1 of SPP 2.6 provides a framework for calculation of the coastal processes and their coastal hazards. It provides guidance on the standard cases, variables, differences to these standard cases, and the allowances you need to consider. But the methodology of calculation of coastal hazard assessments will change depending on the classification of the coast, the coastal type, and your location, among other factors. So the calculation of coastal processes will be different depending on the classification of the coast, and this is kind of the first step in completing your coastal hazard assessment. So you need to assess whether your coast is a sandy coast, rocky, whether it's a mixed sandy and rocky shoreline, are there coastal lowlands, is it an estuary, and tidal reaches of estuaries are included in SPP 2.6, or an island. And each of these classifications will be slightly different. The Coast Adapt Shoreline Explorer, which is an online tool with the website location shown below, is a really good tool as a first pass to determine that coastal classification and the type of coast you might be dealing with. So on the figure we've got there, which is an extract from Esperance, it presents a number of those different types of coast. So you can see in this case, we've got sections of sandy beach shown in the magenta or purple line, up in the northern areas around Bandy Creek. On the headlands at the south there, and the areas shown in green, dominantly hard rock shores, and then you may have some mixed types in between those as well. And dependent on the type of coast and the classification of each, we'll assess the coastal hazards slightly differently. So a sandy coast, and these are your typical sandy beaches. Think of areas such as Scarborough or Trigg. We've got unconsolidated, so soft sandy sediments. These are areas where rock is not present or not dominant, or we're uncertain if there's rock. So if we're not sure if there's rock, we'll probably classify the coast as sandy. And as I said, examples include Scarborough. The photograph which is there is from Wiley Head in Esperance. Sections of Bustleton are sandy, or 80 Mile Beach in the north. Rocky coasts, on the other hand, require a continuous rock substrate. So where you do have a continuous rocky coast, which could provide continuous protection to a suitable elevation from the coastal hazards, you classify that as rock. Typically, that protection needs to be to an elevation about 1 metre above the HSD, and that provides sufficient protection from all of those coastal processes. It can be hard rock, it can be soft sedimentary rock. We may have areas of weakly lithified sedimentary rock. They all act slightly differently. Examples of those rocky coasts include areas around Cape Naturalis, so that the photo there of Canal Rocks has some igneous rock down in that area. We've got the cliffs of Kalbarri, or the limestone areas around the northern sections of Perth Metro. That photo which is shown on the bottom right there is from Seascapes, and that kind of typical Tamala limestone you may see. There's also areas of both mixed sandy and rocky coasts. So these might consist of areas that have fringing reefs, for instance, rock or reef platforms on the beach, or reef systems just in the inshore areas. You might have rocky platforms on the beach, or it might be discontinuous rocky shorelines. So we've got maybe small headlands or areas where the rock is broken up or varies. You typically consider the rock in these areas, but we'll complete an assessment as if it's a sandy beach. Examples include the Yanship Lagoon, which has got fringing reefs, Mettams, which is shown in the photo there, which has fringing reefs and some discontinuous rock headlands, Southcott, which has rocky platforms, and that entire northern stretch from Trigg to Sorrento has some discontinuous rock and reef through those areas. Another important classification of coastal lowlands. So coastal lowlands are generally low-lying areas which might include tidal flats or mangroves. They're typically associated with historic river deltas or similar features where you've got finer alluvial sediments. They might be quite mobile. So the photograph there, which is an aerial from up around the Gascoyne region, shows, or the Ashburton, I think, region shows that meandering river mouth, which can obviously break through different sections of that coast and be therefore very mobile from time to time. And so the deltaic landforms of Ashburton and Gascoyne rivers are really good examples of these coastal lowlands. And we'll discuss an example of these a little bit further later in one of the case studies as well. The estuaries and tidal reaches of inland waters are again a different case. So the inland waters are, the SPP 2.6 captures those areas of inland waters which are primarily controlled by coastal processes. So they're affected by the tides and water levels. They also need to be treated differently because they're also affected by river flood events as well. So the estuaries we're talking about will typically include river mouths and estuaries, such as the Swan Estuary, Princess Royal Harbour at Albany, or the Peel Harvey Estuary. And the last classification type we'll discuss are islands. So islands can often incorporate mixed sandy and rocky coasts. We think of examples such as Rottnest Island or the Houghton of Brollis, where we've got some rocky sections, but also some sandy beaches among. We'll now step through the importance of those different classifications of the coast, as well as the importance of appropriately assessing the study area extents. And then we'll step through how we calculate those coastal erosion and inundation hazard allowances. It's important to classify the coast early on in the assessment process, as this determines the method of calculation of the coastal hazards, and particularly the coastal erosion hazards. So these are different for sandy as opposed to rocky, for instance, coasts. And Schedule 1 and the calculation of coastal processes are generally set up for the exposed or open coasts. So other types of coasts might require a modified methodology of assessment. There's more work currently being done around estuaries and the methodologies which are appropriate for those as well. Once we've classified the coast, we then need to consider the appropriate study area for our assessment. And that needs to consider the context of movements and change, shoreline movements and change around our site and the location of the assessment. So the study area is therefore generally defined based on the geomorphology of the coast. It needs to consider the entire sediment cell so that we can assess changes within the cell. So we've discussed sediment cells in previous modules, but we'll just do a quick recap on those. A sediment cell is typically a length of shoreline or coastline and the adjacent nearshore areas within which the sediment movement is largely self-contained. So we're not seeing too much movement outside of this cell or into this cell from outside. In the figure there we can see the blue line, which is an outline of the secondary sediment cell. Sediment cells are typically broken into primary, secondary and tertiary cells on smaller scales. And you can see the figure there attempts to capture all the pathways of sediment movement within that cell. Around Western Australia, the sediment cells have largely been defined in previous works and studies by DOT, and those sediment cells are available on their website. There's a link to that below. So we've discussed the classification of the coast, we've discussed the study areas or extents which we should be considering. Now we'll step through the appropriate allowances for coastal erosion. So the coastal erosion allowances are calculated by summing a series of individual allowances. So S1 is the allowance for the current risk of storm erosion of that 100-year or 1% AEP event. S2 is an allowance for historic shoreline movement trends. S3 is an allowance for erosion caused by potential future sea level rise, and there's an additional allowance for uncertainty, which provides a kind of factor of safety. And we sum all those up and we get a coastal erosion allowance. And we're going to step through each of those in a second. It's also important to note that the methodology for calculating a number of those individual allowances has changed over time, and the recommended best practice in calculating those is changing, and it's likely to continue to change into the future as kind of assessment methods are defined further. So this figure diagrammatically shows the summing of those coastal erosion allowances. We can see the horizontal shoreline data in the HSD we discussed before is the reference point, so that kind of the limit of the water level in a significant storm event is the reference that each of these lines are then measured back from. So we have our S1 allowance for storm erosion, we have our S2 allowance for longer term shoreline erosion trends, we have our S3 allowance for potential erosion due to sea level rise, and then an additional uncertainty allowance at the back. We sum all those up, and that's how we determine those coastal erosion hazard lines. The first allowance, the S1 allowance for storm erosion, allows for that risk of acute storm erosion from a single storm event or a series or sequence of storm events. The picture we've got there from Pinaroo on the right-hand side shows your classic storm event on a sandy beach where we've got waves and water levels acting on the back of the dunes and eating away at the base of the dunes. So what we do is we typically model that storm event via a sediment transport model, such as S beach or X beach. We'll input to that model the 1% AEP event for beach erosion, and we'll calculate then from the output a cross-shore erosion distance, which will be used as that allowance. This can also be used as a trigger for a retreat of an asset. So when the shoreline is getting that close to an asset, it may be an appropriate time to consider relocation or retreat. We'll discuss the methodology in calculating this for a standard sandy coastline and for the standard coast case under SPP 2.6. But it's important to note that SPP 2.6 and that standard case are set up for land development primarily, and other strategic assets or different cases may have higher requirements for a less frequent storm. So for instance, if you're considering an asset such as a hospital or an airport, you may want to consider a different storm event. The location of your site is important for assessing the design storms and events which you'll model to determine that S1 allowance. So in the northern parts of the state, we obviously can experience cyclonic events, and these will be very different to the storm events we'll see in the southwestern parts of the state. Depending on your location around the state, you'll therefore use a different design storm event for both. And the Department of Transport provides guidance on both of those. They've produced publications for determining those design storms, and design storms for your particular location can be provided on request from the department. Once we've determined our design event or design storm, that design storm will then be modelled on a representative profile to determine the S1 allowance. So we need to select profiles which are representative of our section of coastline we're considering, and that can vary depending on where we are, and even vary within one study area. So factors such as the orientation of your coast, whether there's any rock or reef in the inshore areas or on the beach, the height of the dunes, the slope of the dunes and beach and nearshore areas, the bathymetry and depth of water near shore. These factors can all have a big impact on beach erosion. If we look on the figure on the right-hand side, which is an aerial photo of, I think that's Ledge Point, you can see within just this small study area, we've got sections of coast which vary dramatically. So we've got different orientations, we've got sections of reef near shore, and we've got varying dune heights through there. So in this particular case, we've taken 3 profiles over the study site to be representative of that study area. So we've selected our representative profiles. We've got design events, and those design events have been selected specifically for our location. The storm selection paper or design cyclone guidance can suggest potential events for your location. And once we've got those, we'll set up our model and run that. It's really important that some model validation or calibration is completed, so we don't just throw this design storm into our model, spit out an answer and take that as gospel. We've got to really do some checks and some sanity checks on those. Otherwise, you can greatly overestimate or underestimate the potential erosion. And common things may be greatly overestimating or underestimating water levels in the nearshore areas, and that can have a big impact on the beach erosion we're seeing. So we'll always want to do a sanity check on that modelling data. We've now got a design event which has been established and modelled over our representative profiles in our S beach or X beach or similar. So the example plot we've shown there is an output from S beach. This one shows, there's several lines in this, so I'll just step through what they are. We can see a black line underneath, which is an input beach profile prior to the storm event. We model that with waves, which are the green line showing the maximum wave height as we come into the shore. We've got water levels on there, which is the magenta line, and they act to erode the beach. So this red line is the profile of the beach following the storm event. So that's our output. We can calculate the HSD from this storm simulation. It's the maximum water level during that storm. We determine that HSD, and then we determine the distance back behind that. And in this case, we've got a HSD at this elevation, we've got 26 metres of erosion back behind that point. So in this particular case, our S1 allowance would be 26 metres. This presents the current day risk of storm erosion. So it didn't include any sea level rise, but it's a present day risk. The policy has a default allowance in there of 40 metres, This is generally conservative, but not always conservative. So typically you want to do your own assessment for your site. Along with the output of the modelling of the design event, there's a number of other considerations we should think about in determining our S1 allowance. So these include the slope failure and the stability of the eroded dunes after the design storm. So you can see in the photograph on the right here, a typical sandy beach after a storm event where we've got a really steep vertical face at the front of the dunes, and that's obviously unstable in the longer term. So we want to make sure we're accounting for that slope failure in our allowance. We want to make sure we're considering any deficits in longshore erosion from or during those storm events, any shoreline controls and the impacts of those, for instance, groins or headlands or breakwaters in the area. These all need to be considered in determining our total S1 allowance. As we noted before, SPP 2.6 does refer to a default value of 40 metres. However, this should be used with caution as it's not always conservative. So we've discussed the classification of the coast, discussed determining study areas and extents of our assessment, the S1 allowance. We'll now step through the S2 allowance and the longshore or allowance for longshore long-term erosion trends. So the historic shoreline movement allowance is typically based on shoreline records or longer-term shoreline positions. We'd ideally want a period of record around 40 years or more, and shoreline positions every 5 years or so. This is ideal, but not always possible, and so we need to make sure we're, particularly when we've got shorter term records, that we're really considering short-term changes as well as overall net movement changes. So in Western Australia, the Department of Transport maps shoreline movement via mapping of the coastal vegetation line. This can be found at the link shown below. And what this looks like is that map on the right-hand side. So the position of the coastal vegetation line as an indicator of shoreline position is mapped from aerial photographs. And each one of these coloured lines is the position of the shoreline at a point in time. By mapping those obviously over a long period of time, we can build up a record of the shoreline position. So the historic shoreline movements and the determination of erosion trends are important to be assessed over the complete sediment cell. So we want to make sure we're considering all kinds of changes and the processes in that cell and how they may have changed over a longer term period. So as an example, construction of a harbour, construction of a groin, installation of an offshore breakwater or headland, all of these features would change the local coastal processes and the local dynamics. So it's really no use considering changes prior to that construction, and we want to assess the period after construction to get a handle on potential shoreline movement trends going forward. As an example of where these shorter term trends can be really important, the aerial here is from a section of beach in North Coogee within the city of Coburn. This is Catherine Point groin at the southern end, Island Street groin at the north, and we've got a section of sandy beach controlled by those groins. There's also an offshore sandbank out here, Success Bank, which feeds sand onshore. Now this feed of sand from Success Bank was leading to long-term shoreline accretion. Catherine Point groin at the south was installed, the accretion continued, the groin was extended, the accretion continued, and looked like we had this ongoing accretion trend for years. That can persisted for decades, and you can see the vegetation lines historically were out 100 metres or so further out than they currently are. So when we assess shoreline change, if we assess net change from the 40s, which were back here, out to the 90s, we've got a vegetation lines out here. We've got a significant accretion trend. However, since about the mid-90s, we've had a persistent erosion trend, and these are the current shorelines obviously back here now. We've had persistent and consistent erosion for several decades. So over the 80-year full period we have shoreline movement for, from this red line to these blue lines through here, we've actually got a net change of accretion, but this is misleading. We've obviously had a strong and persistent recent history of accretion. So we want to make sure we're considering time histories, we're considering shorter term trends as well as overall change, as well as works in the area and changes to those coastal dynamics and processes when we're determining our historic erosion trends. It's therefore important that the assessment's completed by experienced personnel who have a history and experience in calculating these types of things. Once we've determined our shoreline positions over a long period of time, and we've calculated a long-term rate of change, that long-term rate of erosion is then used to determine our S2 allowance. So the allowance will be 100 times the long-term rate of erosion. So if our shoreline's been retreating or eroding at half a metre per year, then our S2 allowance will be 100 times that, which is 50 metres for the coming 100 years. Now, if we've got an accretion trend at our site, if it's a small accretion trend, less than 0.2 metres per year, then our S2 allowance will be 0. We won't have any allowance for future erosion. If we've got an ongoing large accretion trend, so if our accretion trend is greater than 0.2 metres per year, then we'll actually account for that in our assessment and we'll offset the erosion allowance to account for that accretion. So in an area where we've got an accretion trend greater than 0.2 metres per year and we expect that to continue, our S2 allowance will actually be negative 50 times that long-term rate. And that'll just offset some of that hazard allowance. So in our coastal erosion allowances, we've discussed the S1 storm erosion allowance, we've discussed our long-term erosion allowance. S3 is then the erosion due to potential sea level rise. The S3 allowance allows for beach erosion due to sea level rise. The base assumption of this is that as the sea levels rise, the entire beach and dune profile shifts backwards. And so we get, for every centimetre of sea level rise, about a metre erosion of a sandy beach. Now, this is a general rule of thumb for gently sloping sandy coastlines, but it seems to be reasonably conservative and appropriate for our coast in Western Australia. The Department of Transport has determined appropriate sea level rise allowances for use in Western Australia and coastal planning for the coming 100 years. And they allow for 0.9 metres of sea level rise out to 2110, corresponding to 90 metres of erosion in that 100-year period. For every year past 2110, they then allow an additional centimetre of sea level rise, corresponding to an additional metre of erosion. So for the 100-year period out to 2124, we'd currently allow 104 metres for our S3 allowance. So compared to the other ones we've discussed already, S3 is generally the greatest allowance. Both sea level rise allowances and the S3 allowance, and the determination of that are currently under review. And if there's any change to those allowances, Department of Transport will release an updated or an update to that. Along with S1, S2 and S3, the coastal erosion allowance also includes an allowance. All of these allowances and factors we've talked about have uncertainty built into them. We're attempting to simplify extremely complex coastal processes and dynamics into basic allowances. And as a result, SPP 2.6 adopts a precautionary principle. This accounts for, I guess, unknowns going forward, uncertainties and things which are hard to predict. So an additional 0.2 metres per year is added to the calculated coastal erosion allowances, and that equates to 20 metres over that 100-year planning horizon. So that counters things such as those changes in trends we talked about earlier, where you can see long-term periods of accretion followed by long-term periods of change. Or the example in the photograph is shown here is Turn Bank within Safety Bay in the city of Rockingham, which is an area which has changed dramatically over the last several decades. The bank here has continued to grow. It's moved into a navigation channel. It's creating a lagoon and other sheltered areas nearby, but it's drastically changing the coastal processes. And some of these things are really hard to predict. So as a result, there's a factor of safety built into the allowance for uncertainty. Existing controls can also change our coastal hazard assessments. So these existing controls can be natural or engineered controls. The photograph here from Silver Sands in Mandurah shows how the location of a groin or similar coastal management structure can change the coastal processes. So protection structures such as groins and seawalls, or management actions such as sand nourishment or bypassing, can all change our hazard assessments. And in order to account for those in our process, we need to be sure that there's going to be ongoing maintenance of those or continued management, that they're going to continue into the future. So often in our coastal hazard assessments, what we might do is consider a case with and without controls, and both of those can be slightly different. One of these controls can be the location of competent rock. So we talked earlier about the different methodologies for completing coastal erosion assessments if you've got a sandy or a rocky shoreline. Well, often it can be unclear. The rock can be buried under the sand. It may not be obviously continuous, and you may not know the level of that rock. And geotechnical or geophysical investigations may therefore be required. These can investigate the presence, the elevation, the continuity, and the suitability of that rock to withstand coastal erosion. They may require iteration, so you might need to, for instance, complete storm erosion modelling to determine a HSD elevation before determining whether your rock's at a suitable elevation to protect from that. And CoastWA have an ongoing expression of interest out at the moment to provide grant funding for geotechnical and geophysical investigations where appropriate to assist in coastal hazard assessments. So there's various methods of completing these. Geophysical investigations can often need calibration or truthing in order to provide better results. Geotechnical investigations are often a higher cost but can provide some more certainty with their results. And these include things such as CPTs, boreholes, probes, etc. Regardless of the methodology, we'd always recommend using a geologist or a geotechnical engineer or specialist to complete these investigations for you, and they can provide information on, for instance, risk of rock weathering and collapse and the erodibility of that rock. We've discussed the individual allowances in coastal erosion hazards. We'll now just discuss how they're summed to calculate the total coastal erosion. The total coastal erosion hazard is calculated just by summing all of those individual allowances. So you can see in the table here we've got a range of timeframes from the present day out to 100 years. We've got our S1, S2, S3, our uncertainty factor, and the total is just the sum of each of those. Now obviously in the present day the only risk we have at the moment is S1 storm erosion. We don't have any long-term erosion risk, we don't have any sea level rise erosion risk or uncertainty, and so we have a much smaller allowance. As we move our way through the full range of timeframes, our greatest allowances are obviously over that full planning period. All of these measurements are measured from the HSD. So we've calculated our coastal erosion hazards, and these are plotted over the map. So we can see on this figure our HSD line is right at the front of the dune, and that's that black line, and all our coastal erosion hazard allowances are measured back from that. So our present day risk, our 50-year risk, and our 100-year risk. And this is the typical map that you might see for your coastal erosion output. So we've discussed the classification of our sites. We've discussed the extents or study area which is appropriate for assessment, and we've discussed the coastal erosion allowance. We're now going to step through the coastal inundation allowance methodology. And a coastal inundation allowance is calculated similarly for all locations around the state. So it's allowance for the current risk of inundations in the present day from our 500-year or 0.2% AEP event, plus the predicted extent of sea level rise in that planning period. So we need to consider things such as nearshore setup, wave run-up, wave overtopping, and potential dune breaching. And also just be aware of datums. So often when we're dealing with water levels, we might see various datums around the place. AHD, or Australian Height Datum, is generally set up around about mean sea level. We might see things such as chart datum, which is lower and often specified or benchmarked locally. So just always be aware of what we're actually the levels mean for our particular site. So similarly to coastal erosion, our design event for inundation varies dependent on location. So in the northern parts of our state, in area 1 and 2 in this particular graph, the cyclonic events are dominant. In the areas 3 and 4, mid-latitude depressions can also be experienced. So particularly for Area 3, we can see some cyclonic events coming through as well. But either way, both require that 500-year event to be considered. It's also important to note this is a different event to beach erosion. So the type of event which might which might cause elevated water levels, can be very different to the type of event which can cause beach erosion. So it will be a very specifically different event. And so this table just presents some summed coastal inundation allowances. So again, over our range of timeframes from our present day out to our 100-year planning period, we've got a peak steady water level calculated from modelling or such, or from extreme records. We've got an allowance for nearshore setup. We've got an allowance for sea level rise over our planning period, and we calculate from summing those a total S4 allowance. And these will obviously vary around our locations in our state. From those allowances, we then can create hazard maps. The example here from Rat Island in the Abrolhos Islands, the shading areas present different areas which are inundated for different timeframes. And we can see there we've got present day, some present day flooding areas along with the longer timeframes as well. And these are pretty typical of our inundation maps. Once we've got our output from our assessment, we've got our coastal hazard maps, we'll step through how we actually apply those and what they mean. So the hazard maps are used in risk assessments to determine risks to assets, to visually communicate potential hazard areas to stakeholders, and in completion of cost-benefit analysis. The example here shows a hazard map for a section of Sorrento Beach, where we've got each of our coastal erosion hazard lines shown, and we've got some key assets identified in various colours of shading there. The coastal hazard maps can be used to set up foreshore reserves, special control areas, to place notifications on titles for those areas those properties which may be shown to be within coastal hazard areas, to red flag development approvals for those areas within hazard zones, as a foundation for adaptation pathways and implementation, and also for triggers for managed retreat. So as an example, the figure on the right hand side here shows the Surfing WA building, the new headquarters building, which was constructed several years ago in Trig. In this particular case, it was determined an appropriate trigger was 25 metres in front of the building. So if the shoreline retreats, or if the HSD retreats to being within that 25 metres, then that triggers an appropriate time to commence investigations for relocation or removal of that building. And this can be built into development approvals. We've discussed standard and typical cases for determination of coastal hazard assessments, but around the state there's a number of non-typical cases and a number of questions which might arise in completing coastal hazard assessments. So I'll step through some of the challenges and advice around those now. And a common question is around the level of accuracy needed for a coastal hazard assessment. Now that will depend on the application and what you're attempting to get out of the assessment. So if you're looking citywide or regional, shire-wide at a large-scale study to identify, for instance, critical areas that might need some further investigation, well, you probably don't need to do complete your assessment in as much detail as if you're doing a local assessment for a very significant asset which is right on the coast. That may require some increased accuracy compared to the broader scale one. A coastal hazard assessment which has been completed as part of a CHAR map will also affect every following part of the CHAR map. So your cost-benefit analysis which you do will only be as accurate as your coastal hazard assessment was at the start. So again, you'll need quite a detailed assessment for that. The figure which is shown at the bottom here is from the local coastal hazard assessment template on the Department of Transport website, and just gives an indication that if you're looking over at the bottom of the period there, over a short time scale and a short distance, then so on a really local scale, then you might need more detailed data. You might need more effort in modelling and analysis of that data than if you're looking over a more regional scale, 10 plus kilometres, 100 plus years, just to inform some high-level strategic planning. You probably don't need as much data. You probably don't need as detailed modelling as you would for a more detailed local case. So for those small local areas, we can refer to the local coastal hazard assessment generic scope on the Transport website. Now this is intended as a guide only, and it's set up for small areas and short term, so less than 25-year periods. It typically uses coastal monitoring data, which has been collated and collected over recent years, and it can be used to refine short-term actions and triggers. A question which also arises a lot is, can you just use a neighbouring or default coastal hazard assessment and, and use that for an adjacent section of coast? So there may be cases where this is appropriate, but you'd first need to consider, are the classifications of coast similar? Are the exposure to coastal processes and conditions similar? Are historic trends in shoreline movement similar? Do they have similar shoreline forms or geomorphologies? If all these things are the same, there may be a case just to replicate it. In terms of a default assessment, in order to cover kind of the full range of conditions which might be experienced, a default case would need to be very, very conservative. And therefore that's not typically recommended, although it could be considered just as a first pass if you don't have any other concerns. Most importantly, though, is ensuring that the implications are understood. So if you're doing a first pass default type assessment, or you're just copying one from another and bringing it up the coast to something which looks very similar, you really need to be overestimating those hazards and taking a conservative view. And that would therefore mean that anything that flows from that in terms of your adaptation and cost requirements are also going to be conservative and overestimates of likely requirements. So as an example, sections of the coast within the city of Stirling, we've got two photos here from Brighton Beach and Scarborough Beach, which are long, straight, sandy coasts. Now, they've got reasonably similar exposure, they've got reasonably similar orientations, they typically experience similar conditions, they're adjacent to each other. So in this particular case where you have such consistency from the two, if you've got a detailed assessment at Brighton Beach, you may simply be able to take that to Scarborough or vice versa. On the other hand, taking an assessment completed for a straight sandy beach at Brighton and applying that to a location such as North Beach, although it's both within the city of Stirling, they're several kilometres from each other, the classification, the trends in movement, the shoreline type, the elevations, they all vary between these two sections of coast. So North Beach includes some rocky coast, Brighton sandy, etc. They're just completely different, and as a result you can't pick up one assessment from one and apply it to the other. So with that case of a default, if we're considering using a default coastal hazard assessment, well, what allowances do you use? You can have differences of hundreds of metres in a coastal hazard assessment or in shoreline movements within several kilometres. So these two snapshots of shoreline movements we've shown on the right-hand side here are from sections of shoreline within the city of Rockingham. So they're in the scale of 5 kilometres apart. In one case, we can see a consistent erosion trend where we've had shorelines out here in the water through the 40s, which have been progressively eroding over many decades since. Several kilometres away, we've had the case where we've had consistent and persistent accretion. So the shoreline movement trends and the S2 allowances in both those cases are going to be completely different. So what default would you use? If you've got a very conservative default allowing for the erosion case, you're going to be greatly overestimating your coastal hazard allowances for the case where you're experiencing accretion. So as a result, it's strongly recommended that some form of coastal hazard assessment is always completed. The level of effort might vary depending on what you're trying to get out of it, but we always want some form of assessment completed, and just provides the context and reality to your site. These can always be tailored to the level of accuracy, needs and budgets required. It's also important to understand the coastal hazard lines and what they mean. So the coastal hazards are determined specifically for coastal planning purposes. They're set up and determined in line with the planning policy document, and they're inherently conservative. We talked about the fact that they adopt the precautionary principles, so they're intended to be conservative. As a result, some of the understanding and terminology and so on can mislead. So the hazard lines are not estimates of the likely shoreline position. They do not attempt to predict where the shoreline will be at a period of time. They're simply identifying areas which may be impacted by hazards. They're not appropriate for engineering design. Again, they're not best estimates of where the shoreline will be. They're simply presenting areas which may be impacted. There's also cases where maps have been produced which say things such as likely and unlikely areas of coastal hazard. Again, these can be quite misleading as they typically have connotations with probabilities, which might not be the case in planning purposes. So some of those common misconceptions, as we just discussed, are that the hazard lines show or predict where the future shoreline will be. Now, this is not the case. For those hazard lines, particularly the ones in the longer time frames, for them to be realised, they require the worst erosion trend at that site to continue for that whole planning period, plus all the sea level rise or erosion to occur, plus a larger storm than's previously been experienced at that site to occur, all occurring at the end of the planning period, plus then additional erosion to counter for the allowance for uncertainty. So only if all those things happen will those hazard lines be realised. So it's always important to keep that context in mind. You might also hear that statements such as the shoreline's currently accreting, so the hazard lines are crazy. Well, as we discussed before, the largest component of those hazard lines is the sea level rise component, and that really comes into fruition later in the planning period. So the shoreline may be accreting at the moment. That doesn't mean it's always going to accrete into the future, and there'll come a time when it will flick to an erosive trend. We also hear often that we've never had that much storm erosion occur. It can't happen. It's crazy. Well, the storm erosion predicted or modelled under that 1% AEP event is intended to be a very, very severe storm, the likes of which we haven't seen on a lot of these beaches in recorded or at least recent history. So these are the kind of comments we might often hear. Another question which is often asked is how often shall I update or redo our coastal hazard assessments? And it does require a balance because we want a contemporary assessment, we want it to be current, but we don't want to regularly be updating this every year. And every time we do update them, the numbers will change. Even if they're only by a couple of metres, they will look different. So as a result, you typically want to update the coastal hazard assessment around 10-year intervals. It seems about right to give that balance. Or if there's a significant change in information. So if, for instance, recommendations around sea level rise change and that has the potential to impact coastal hazard assessments, then you may want to reconsider your previous one. If you complete some geotech investigations and that changes the type of coast you believe you have, that might be cause to update an assessment. If you're starting to see a significant change in shoreline trends or processes, for instance, an area which was previously accreting is now eroding or vice versa, then again, that might be worthwhile redoing or updating a coastal hazard assessment. Or if there's a significant change in policy or guidance around the state coastal planning policy or the like, then again, it may be worthwhile updating that assessment. As I noted, that every time you do a new assessment, your hazards will change. So the hazard lines require careful assessment. The base year, the year you're using them or determining them from, will affects all of our sea level rise allowances and therefore affects our erosion allowances. So the shoreline movement rates every time we do an updated assessment will typically change, and that's going to be the largest change we see. The methodology for calculating storm erosion also has changed in recent years. And the recommendations around design storms. So all of these little tweaks and little changes will mean that your numbers and your lines change. As a result, or that needs to be carefully communicated, particularly to stakeholders who may, for instance, see their property now being within a hazard line. It's important to note the hazard lines do change, but the best estimate of those hazards or the risk to assets may not. So we've just always got to be aware of the implications every time you're doing a new assessment. DPLH provide updated guidance on changes to policy or recommendations as appropriate, and requirements. So while the policy might not change, requirements or recommendations within the bounds of that policy can. So we did talk about the fact that design storms have been formulated since the State Coastal Planning Policy in its current form was promulgated. Department of Transport can provide information on that appropriate methodology now, and an updated methodology for calculation of hazards. At the moment, there's a bit more work being done on appropriate methodologies for assessing coastal hazards in estuary areas. There's also a review of design cyclones underway, and Department of Planning is undertaking a refresher on SPP 2.6 and their guidance on sea level rise. So all these things are in review and being considered at the moment. As a result, it's always recommended that you consult early with Department of Planning and Department of Transport just to make sure you're on top of the current views and best practices on application of policies. We defined the HSD earlier, and one of the challenges can be this is a little bit tricky to define in cyclonic areas. So cyclonic water levels, and particularly in areas where you already have significant tidal range, can result in significant inundation. This might result in the HSD in those cyclonic events being behind the potential area of, or extent of erosion. So we'll discuss a case study on this a bit later on, but we can often see the example where our S2 allowances and our S3 allowances are actually captured within the closer to the coast than what we might see from our definition of HSD. So this can provide a challenge. We'll show this in the case study a little bit more detail further on. So I'm now going to step through a number of case studies and examples of how we apply a standard coastal hazard assessment, and also some differing cases. The first of these case studies is Point Moore at Geraldton. It's a reasonably typical assessment. There was previous coastal processes assessments completed for the area around Point Moore, which is kind of near the port within Geraldton. These previous assessments were inconsistent with State Planning Policy 2.6, and therefore a coastal hazard assessment study was completed for both erosion and inundation. Now, for Point Moore, being located in the northern parts of the state, cyclonic activity is important. So the inundation assessment particularly was completed for cyclonic storm surge inundation, non-cyclonic storm surge inundation, and also tsunami-induced inundation. So this required detailed simulation of cyclonic conditions to synthesize a record of cyclones and consider those range of events. The inundation assessment included the 500-year ARI event, as well as sea level rise out to 2110, and the output of those coastal inundation maps are shown on the screen. You can see that most of Point Moore is underwater out in the 20-year planning horizon. The erosion assessment for Point Moore considered the geomorphology and sediment pathways for the area. So there'd been some detailed assessments completed on sediment budgets and sediment models for the area. These were used, and the site was assessed for storm erosion and shoreline movement. The coastal management actions around the port, so the sand bypassing of the port was considered, along with the engineered controls in the area, which included the port at the upper end of the compartment, along with a groin on the beach. So these coastal erosion hazards were estimated for the present day and various timeframes out to the 100-year period. And the output of the coastal erosion maps we can see on the screen, showing that potential erosion over the full planning period. So the Point Moore assessment included a detailed cyclonic assessment and was site-specific. It was completed several years ago now, so to do this again in that area, the assessment could have been simplified with the cyclonic design storms which are now available, but at the time it was a detailed cyclonic assessment, and it also considered the controls in the area and landform stability in the hazard assessment. The second case study I wanted to discuss was a more regional assessment. So the Shire of Jerramunga were developing an updated coastal management plan. As part of that, they required consideration of the coastal hazards over the entire Shire. This was a more regional assessment, so it was a first pass assessment. There wasn't a lot of available information across the Shire in terms of shoreline movement or change. It was that real district and regional context, and it was just for application in a foreshore management plan. So it didn't need to be quite as detailed as you may need for a heavily populated char map, for instance. They wanted to consider the following timeframes, so the imminent timeframe of up to 5 years, expected out to 25 years, and projected longer term timeframes of up to 100 years. So the extents of the Shire Eromanga up on the south coast, they extend from the city of Albany to Ravensthorpe, and you can see we've got a lot of rocky headlands protecting sheltered little bays, so quite a large stretch of coast. We looked through the classification of this coast using the Coast Adapt Shoreline Explorer. We can see we've got sections of hard coast on those headlands, along with some sandy beaches in between. And the photographs on the right-hand side show this, where we've got these rocky outcrops, and then very sandy shoreline bays, sandy beaches with sand dunes in behind. So again, the shoreline had to be classified in those different types, and the assessment was different for each. We determined the S1. As I said, there wasn't a whole lot of available information, but we determined a representative sandy profile where some information did exist. We got some survey data and drew a profile out through one of the sandy beaches. We used offshore conditions which had been recorded in extreme events as input to our design storm. We estimated some water levels from an online tool called Canute, which provides estimates of extreme water levels around Australia. We had a sediment sample taken from site, and we put all these things in to our sediment model, and we modelled a design storm estimated to be the 100-year design event for beach erosion. From this, we estimated both our HSD and our S1 allowance, which in this particular case was 35 metres of erosion behind that sandy dune. For our S2 allowance, the Department of Transport did have shoreline movement lines available from 1991. So this provided history over several decades. We updated this with mapping from aerial photography taken in 2014. This gave us a couple of decades of record, and we've therefore estimated rates of change for each individual compartment through the coast. We summed these S1 and S2 along with our standard S3 allowances for sea level rise and uncertainty, and we got a range of allowances over various timeframes. We prepared the maps on this basis, so you can see one of the maps, or an extract from one of the maps on the right hand side. We've got a section of sandy beach up to the on the western end, and coastal erosion hazard lines in behind that. Behind the rocky section of shoreline, we had smaller allowances for those rock coasts. To calculate the coastal inundation allowance, again, we had limited information on local water levels. The online Canute tool was used as a first pass estimate to calculate the 500-year ARR water level, and we used S-Beach locally to then model that nearshore setup and calculate some water levels on the coast. We summed these up along with our sea level rise allowances, and we got some total coastal inundation levels in the order of 2.3 to 3.2 metres over the planning period. So for this case, at Eromanga, it was a first pass assessment. We made use of the available information in a cost-effective way. It was important to still retain, as it was a first pass assessment without a whole lot of detailed information. It was therefore important to retain a level of conservatism in the numbers, and we made recommendations through the assessment on gaps in data or ways to refine or improve that assessment if that was needed. The third example I want to discuss was one completed up in the Pilbara for Atlas Island. It was completed for the Ridley Magnetite project, which is located at Utah Point near Port Hedland. It included a D-cell pipeline crossing the coast, and the client wanted to complete a coastal hazard assessment to understand the risks to the mine site along with the pipe crossing. So this assessment was completed over the 30 years as an intermediate time frame, as this is the expected project life, along with the full 100-year planning horizon. And here we can see we've got Port Hedland, we've got Utah Point, and the project site out here. So the Atlas Island site generally consisted of a coastline which is generally sand flats, backed by several kilometres of low-lying foredune ridges, and inland of those ridges is floodplain. So really quite low-lying coastline, fairly benign under ambient conditions, but obviously can experience cyclonic conditions when the tropical cyclones are experienced. There's been a char map completed nearby, which included modelling of design water levels. This has been completed for both Port Hedland and Shelburne at nearby sites, and this provides waves and water levels for use in that S1 modelling. So these were extracted. The design cyclonic event was modelled in S Beach to determine significant water levels, and this is that case I discussed earlier where we've got a HSD calculated up at 6.8 metres AHD, which is approximately 400 metres inland. Now, we're not seeing any erosion behind that point. All of the erosion experienced at the site is occurring on the beach and the primary foredune. However, we can see 25 odd metres of erosion in that particular location. For the S2 allowance, we mapped the shoreline over a number of years. The rates of change were estimated and showed that there'd been a history of long-term accretion at the site. The allowance for accretion was greater than that 0.2 metres per year, so the S2 allowance was calculated at 0.5 times the long-term rate to account for that. These allowances were summed, including that allowance for long-term accretion, and we calculate allowances in the order of 1 to 80 odd metres. Now, while those allowances are quite small, as we discussed before, the HSD was so far back from the coast, 400 to 500 metres, that all of our lines are still several hundred metres back from the shoreline, and that's just a result of those cyclonic elevated water levels we see in the cyclonic event. A coastal inundation allowance was also complete, a coastal inundation assessment was also completed, and this has been completed for adjacent areas to determine water levels, which was summarised and mapped for this assessment, and shows large inundation of that floodplain. So the map output here shows the coastal inundation assessment, and you can see large swathes of that, those floodplains and surrounding lands being inundated. The last case I wanted to talk about was Port Coogee Southern Peninsula as a different form of coastal hazard assessment. So we have an existing marina and mixed-use development, which is protected entirely by breakwaters and seawalls. However, this Southern Peninsula, shaded in red, is still undeveloped. The developer now wants to develop on that land, and a coastal hazard assessment was therefore required. Now, there's a number of existing controls in place. They include the breakwaters and seawalls. These protect that subject land from coastal erosion. Now, in this particular case, it's not practical or rational to complete an assessment without those controls. The controls exist to protect that land. However, the developer and approval authorities needed to require confidence that they would be maintained and upgraded as required across the full planning period, in order to provide a valid protection for the property. So the inundation assessment considered the 500-year ARI event, along with sea level rise over that coming 100 years, and the inundation map was prepared, and this shows, as you'd expect, the breakwaters and seawalls protecting that land from inundation during the design event. Along with the straight inundation, the assessment also required consideration of wave overtopping. So in those design events, when we have waves breaking on the breakwaters and seawalls, we can get water and spray coming over the top of the structures. So the wave overtopping was assessed for the 500-year RI event again. This required details of the structure to be known, including elevations and type of seawall. An allowance was included for sea level rise, and calculations on acceptable levels of wave overtopping were completed. This confirmed the distances behind the seawalls that the assets needed to be located to be safe or to have tolerable levels of overtopping being experienced. This was a case of existing development. It required consideration of the existing coastal protection and considered inundation and wave overtopping. And it's just a different form of coastal hazard assessment to those undeveloped cases we talked about before. The last one I wanted to discuss was the estuary case. So estuaries are specific cases which are generally more sheltered. They are inland and they have very different processes typically to those on the exposed or open coast. So the calculation and methodology in SPP 2.6 is really set up for the exposed and open coast. So estuaries are just a slightly different variation on that. They're generally pretty sheltered. And their processes and responses to sea level rise can therefore be different to what would be seen on the open coast. Examples around Western Australia include the Peel Harvey and Swan Canning estuaries, and the map there shows the Peel Harvey system just south of Mandurah. In completing a coastal hazard assessment for an estuary, the S1 assessment component is generally consistent with SPP 2.6 standard methodology in that it requires consideration of a severe storm event. However, that storm event is likely to be wind-based. So the design storm will be different to what you see on an open coast, but it's still a 100-year storm erosion event. The S2 assessment would also be consistent, so you'd assess changes to shoreline movement over a period of time, project that forward over the planning periods. But the S3 assessment in response to sea level rise would often be a more detailed or varied form of response. So the erosion assessment would consider a foreshore rollover method where that foreshore berm is rolled back over time as sea levels rise. Differently to the assumption of profile change that occurs on the open coast. So there's just a bit of a different methodology around that S3 component. The S4 assessment on inundation would also need to include rainfall and river flood contribution to total water levels, and so again a slightly different form of assessment on an estuary. These are special cases, and there's further work being done around these methodologies at the moment. And guidance on this could be gained from Department of Planning at the moment.